So I'm going to introduce Marcus Roston, who now works for the West New York Land Conservancy as the Wildways Director. And as I said, he's a member of the Birds on the Niagara Board, and he's been organizing all of our outdoor walks that we've done directly through Birds on the Niagara. And Marcus has a great job and a great project, and he's working for a great organization, which I know you've heard about a lot today, the West New York Land Conservancy. So come on up, Marcus, and welcome.
All right, thanks everyone. Very excited to be here today for Birds on Niagara and share what we have been up to at the Western New York Land Conservancy on our latest initiative to help protect Western New York's ecology that we all know and love and that we're here to celebrate today. So this is one of our plans to safeguard that ecology into the future. And then, as you've already been introduced to the Western New York Land Conservancy, I got to make sure we have our mission in there. We are your regional land trust that has been working since 1991 to permanently protect our important areas of natural lands and farmlands in Western New York. And we work in the 8 counties of Western New York, stewarding 22 nature preserves, which I think at this point might be 23 nature preserves, over 60 conservation easements, and protecting just under 8,000 acres of property here in Western New York. So on this map, you can kind of see all of the green dots are places that we have already permanently protected. And when this map was made, those red dots were projects that were currently under works, which is also outdated because we have had a couple of closings at the end of the year. So that number has gone up, and when all of these projects close, we'll have about 4,000 extra acres under our protection. So we are a land conservancy that has been growing exponentially, and part of our plan is to keep that growth going. And where we work is, well, actually Turtle Island. So we are on Seneca territory, the Haudenosaunee territory, and we look to their guidance, and the Haudenosaunee 7th generation principle is what we work towards in thinking about sustainability and how we safeguard our region. And well, I actually want you to go back in time to the last time Western New York was sustainably managed, back when the Haudenosaunee were caretaking all of Western New York. And picture yourself as a black bear in Western New York. 500 years ago, before European colonization came, and you're just a black bear living out your life in Western New York. And if you were a male black bear, your range could span tens or dozens of miles, up to 70,000 miles. A male black bear can roam and ramble. And, 500 years ago, it was really easy to do, and you could do so unencumbered. But as we know, that is not the case today. If you were a black bear plopped in Allegheny State Park and I said, all right, go and explore, try and go, 50 miles, you wouldn't be able to do that unencumbered today. That journey would be a lot more dangerous. So this is where the reality is a lot more frightening today. And, well, has anybody been in the situation where you're at that wildlife and road interface and anybody ever hit something with their car? Yeah, unfortunately, it is an occurrence that happens a lot more frequently than we think. There is a great book that is out right now by Ben Goldfarb. If you've ever read or heard of the book Eager, The Secret Life of Beavers, Ben Goldfarb just recently released a book called Crossings, where he describes the situation that exists today in the United States. And the situation, I probably should warn you, is a pretty dire one, where he writes, "To us, roads signify connection and escape, but to other life forms, they spell death and division. Name your environmental ill, dams, poaching, megafires, and consider that roads kill more creatures with less fanfare than any of them." And this was, unfortunately, a deer that got hit at one of the sites within the Western New York Wildway, which is a pretty common occurrence in Western New York. This was one that is a roadkill that I'll never forget. This was actually the first time that I was ever able to see a fisher, and actually the only time that I've ever seen a fisher. Unfortunately, it was on the side of the roadway and dead. And then this one was another one that happened, and it was a little bit close to home because this happened close to home. This was right around the corner from my house. It was a mink that got hit on the side of the road. And yes, I'm a weird person that has way too many photos of roadkill on their phone, but it is the very visual reminder of just how those roads are dangerous for wildlife. And not only are they dangerous when, we are directly hitting animals with their car, but think about the overall landscape in general, or how, what those roads lead to are also continuing to fragment our landscape. Here is an overall aerial photo of Gott Creek in Erie County. This is over in Amherst, and this is what it looked like before. And this is what you fast forward to, and this is what it looks like today, where in a very short period of time we have a great deal of sprawl happening in Western New York, and where we had nice, big, connected landscapes are becoming fragmented by human development at a dizzying rate. So not only are those roads causing that physical division of that line that is hard to cross, but then the divisions that come along, the subdivisions that come along with them, human developments, make it so that it's a very different landscape if you're that black bear trying to ramble in your range. And then not to mention, we have all of the other environmental issues like habitat loss in general, causing a sharp decline in species, add on climate change at an unsustainable and increasing rate. All of these environmental issues are compounding, and that is what kind of inspired us at the Western New York Land Conservancy to really start thinking about 5 years ago on, well, how can we work to expand our reach and really ensure that Western New York stays viable? Because historically, the land trust movement has really focused on individual parcels and protecting those individual, almost islands of parcels. But as climate change is going to cause animals to either adapt, move, or die, nobody wants to die. Adapting's kind of hard to do in such a very short period of time with climate change ramping up. Animals are going to have to move in order to survive. So that's very difficult to do when you have our fragmented landscape. What we need to do is figure out how we can protect our core areas and link them together, and then also focus on where are our most climate resilient lands, and how can we protect those areas? So those are the questions we started asking ourselves. And then a map came out that really helped inspire our work towards a Wildway, and it was a map released by our partners at the Wildlands Network that maps what they call the Eastern Wildway. And what the Eastern Wildway is they sought out to figure out if we were to follow the half-Earth principle that E.O. Wilson proposed, where the idea of protecting half of the planet for wildlife habitat protection and have the other half be where humans are sustaining their lives, if we can protect that half, that will have a greater effect and protect the most amount of species that you can do. And what they did is they mapped out, well, if we were to protect 50% of the landscape in the East Coast, and we did that as strategic as possible, where would those parcels be? And they released this map, and on it you can see dark green areas that identify core areas of habitat, large intact places that we still have in the East Coast. And then they also have the light green, those corridors that connect them to each other. And it was this map that came out, and then we said, wait a minute. If you look where we are right here in Western New York, on Niagara River Corridor, you have this Eastern Wildway touching us. We fall within this really important mapped out habitat corridor in the East Coast. And it was this map that inspired us to take on the mission of, all right, well, how can we make this Eastern Wildway a reality in Western New York? Because if you look at the broad strokes that the Wildlands Network painted when it came to Eastern or Western New York, you can see that they did get some really important core habitat in there, but then there's a lot of area within that dark green core area that they labeled that doesn't function in that way. So we saw this as our mission to figure out, all right, how can we use our local, our regional knowledge to make this Wildway a reality? Take stewardship of our little section of the Wildway and allow wildlife connectivity in our region. And that is what spurred the Western New York Wildway. That was nicely in that box when I downloaded it, I promise. And what the Western New York Wildway is, it is a landscape-scale conservation plan to connect, protect, and restore Western New York's largest remaining forest. And this is a photo at the Allegheny Wildlands property, one of the properties that the Land Conservancy just recently protected that is within the Wildway, that evokes a Wildway photo or feeling for me of that vast expanse. This is outside of Allegheny State Park, where you have a lot of really healthy habitat that's still disconnected, but how can we figure out how we can emulate those big, vast forests throughout our region? And the Wildway uses a concept known as landscape-scale conservation in order to achieve this mission. And what landscape-scale conservation essentially is it focuses on protecting core areas of habitat, so our largest remaining intact areas. How can we figure out to protect those, make those larger, have bigger cores, and then when those cores aren't able to link together, how can we build corridors or linkages to connect those core habitats together that will allow species to move between them? Because despite how big and vast Allegheny State Park is as a protected area, it is still not large enough to sustain the ecology that has historically been in this region. So we need to strengthen our core areas, make them bigger, but then allow those connections that will allow animals to transfer between them and to move and allow them to expand their ranges. And then in between there is our compatible use areas, knowing that we're not removing humans from the landscape, but how can we figure out where we prioritize wildlife protection, habitat protection, and then where humans are, how can we have smarter development that is still wildlife friendly, but is where we have intentional human settlement and not necessarily unfettered development that we currently have, that sprawl. So, all right, how do we make this a reality? So our goal was to identify what is, a Wildway in Western New York. We had to figure out, what do we mean when we say a core area, and what do we mean when we say a linkage? And we decided to take our cues from a mammal, a fisher, that is a forest dweller. Fishers, they are a carnivore that loves, big forested tracts. They like hanging out in deep forest areas. So we figured if we could make our core areas or model our core areas based on the home range of a female fisher, which is about 4,000 acres, is the smallest area that she requires. That is what we are going to look for in our region to say, all right, this is where we have core areas still intact. And then within that 4,000 acres, we know that it's still even hard to get 4,000 acres of continuous habitat in Western New York. So we really said, all right, well, we want 100-acre tracts inside that core areas to be really intact, but build up to be 4,000 acres. And then we started figuring out, all right, well, the linkages. What would be the best and most ideal places for animals to move between those core areas? And the literature says that those core areas should be about 300 feet minimum in width. They should encompass the shortest path between those cores, have those level topography, and it's best to follow those forested waterways that wildlife are just naturally traveling already. So these are kind of the parameters that we set to define the Wildway in Western New York. So then we kind of got our parameters, so how do we map it out? So what we did is we used GIS, which is a software that essentially allows you to build a bunch of layers on top of each other in a map. And the layers that we looked at were, where are the areas in Western New York that we still have intact natural land? Where are our big matrix forest blocks and linkages? What areas are already protected in Western New York? What areas rank that bottom map is above average resiliency? So what are our most climate resilient areas in Western New York? And then another measurement, and these are all individual layers that are from the Nature Conservancy, like DEC and things like that, but resilient and connected landscape. So we looked at all the available data that kind of quantified where are our best habitat and where are our most climate resilient lands. You put those layers all on top of each other, you assign them a score, and that will allow you to start ranking out each individual 100-acre tract. So the idea is that the more of these qualities that a 100-acre parcel has, the higher the score, the more likely that that parcel is quality wildlife habitat and is habitat that is allowing for habitat or wildlife connectivity. We gave it a score from 1 to 5, and then we mapped it. So this is showing us the areas that are blue are areas that got a score of 5, and those blue areas and those dark green areas are what we use to make our basis of what would be a core area for the Wildway. So you can kind of see that a lot of our core habitat happens to be in the southern tier of our Chautauqua, Allegheny, and Cattaraugus County. There is good or pretty substantial scores in southern Erie, and then the next kind of solid block is up there at Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge. But we know that these areas have roads in between them, so we added another layer, so we put that road layer on, and then we continue to remove those tracts that didn't meet that minimum 4,000 acre requirement, and that is what helped us refine our core area. So, thinking in the paws of that bear, you can't really call it core area if there's a road going between it. And that is what got us to our 38 Wildway core areas that we identified in Western New York that are over 4,000 acres. The average size is about 20,000 acres, and it makes up about 17% of our 8-county area. And you can see, obviously, pretty strong showing in the southern tier, and a little bit more scant as you get a little bit up north. So we know where our biggest habitats are. Now, we got to figure out, well, we know that these aren't enough to sustain the wildlife. How can we connect them to each other to allow just natural movement for feeding, foraging, finding mates, and then also to move and migrate as our climate changes? So we had to figure out, all right, where are the linkages between them? What happens when you change the law? So under that formatting is it just pretty much says what we use to determine our linkage areas between our core areas. So the 3 things that we looked at to find our linkages are riparian buffers. So those are the areas along our streams and our waterways. Those forested buffers are just natural places that wildlife use to travel. So you can kind of see all of the streams illuminated in that first map. Then we also looked at an analysis called least cost paths. So what is the easiest path between natural areas? So what are ways that they can get from one place to another the easiest with that level topography, and it's not an undue burden. And then another analysis going one step before that is, all right, so we know what are the best paths between all these areas, what are those most common best paths between them, a measurement known as betweenness centrality, that essentially says, all right, where are those most important paths, the most common paths between all those core areas? And putting all those together, that is what helped inform our linkages. So this is what we identified as the important linkage areas in Western New York. The light blue incorporates all of the potential linkages between core areas. So those natural areas that are about 300 feet wide and 800,000 acres of linkage potential in Western New York. And then what are the best path linkages? So those are the most intact, the shortest distance, where we predict is the most likely place that wildlife are using to move between areas. So this kind of gave us our calling based on that GIS data of, all right, where are our important cores and what are the areas that are important for wildlife, linking them together. Then we decided to do a more species-specific analysis, and we worked with an ecologist to essentially do a circuitscape analysis for 3 different carnivores in the region to see where are they most predicted to be based off of the habitat qualities that we have in Western New York. So we had a couple of maps made where the dark blue values are where we predict, or where the habitat shows is most favorable for, in this case, a fisher. And then the outline that you see on it, that is showing you where we mapped out the prioritized wildway, so you can see kind of how close we got based off of the species-specific data. And you can see the wildway does encompass a lot of this. It does show there's a lot of habitat potential in Erie County too, or up in Niagara County, probably more than I thought. We also looked at a bobcat and where a bobcat would most likely be predicted to be moving through the region. We are pumped to show that there's also a lot of coverage or overlap with the wildway mapping. I was also shocked to know that there was so much potential bobcat habitat in Niagara County, so this wildway is a good showing. If we can build the path for them to get up there, maybe we'll have more Niagara County bobcat. And then we also looked at that black bear, of where are they both predicted to be moving through the region. And you can see this one especially overlaps right where on that eastern Erie County, western Wyoming and Genesee County line, where, well, we see in the news that they are often moving through and sometimes finding themselves getting in trouble in places like Lancaster. So they're there, and if you put all those 3 species on top of each other, well, you can see that we did a pretty good job on our first analysis of building the wildway, and based off of those species-specific views that we encompass a lot of the areas. This did help us refine our map a little bit more, showed us that maybe we should incorporate a little bit more habitat in southern Erie County, but also helped validate that first analysis went pretty well. So that led us to what we have as our prioritized area and our planning area. So our prioritized area encompasses those core areas, those priority linkages, and then gives them a buffer around them. So this is where we think that the majority of our action should be focused in terms of wildlife connectivity, habitat protection, and then the planning area for the wildway encompasses all of that area. Then you can start to see, well, obviously we can't prioritize habitat protection in the entire planning area because you have the city of Jamestown, city of Olean, you have human development in there. So we got to figure out how in that planning area we work to make those communities more wildlife friendly, work on things like, backyard habitats. A couple of the other speakers talked about planting natives, things like that, where we have those human developments that are a little bit more wildlife compatible, wildlife friendly. And then that got us to where we are today. So this is the Western New York Wildway map with those wildway cores and corridors mapped out. And you can start to see a lot of our favorite areas, at least some of my favorite areas. Allegheny State Park being what I like to call the heart of the Wildway, big, vast core areas with the state park and the state forest surrounding it. But we also have areas in Chautauqua County, our Chautauqua Ridge, a very important wildlife corridor, especially for birds and migrating up that Chautauqua Ridge, very good warbler habitat. You can see that Letchworth State Park and our big forest complex in Allegheny County were identified as priority areas. It does squeeze up a little bit here, as we know, with urban sprawl kind of coming out, But there is still a path that we can see up to Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge and the state wildlife management areas on either side, and then continuing up and making it to Lake Ontario where Oak Orchard Creek reaches the lake. So we got our Western New York Wildway map is the extension of the Eastern Wildway, and we think a very important one. It connects our southern Appalachians, it's southern to us, I should say. I guess they're northern Appalachians, but the Appalachian Mountains, the Allegheny Plateau, connecting it to the lower Great Lakes. We are the only lower Great Lakes connection for the Eastern Wildway, so it's pretty important for us to make that connection, and then continuing all the way up to Lake Ontario. So if you compare that to what the Eastern Wildway kind of broad stroked, you can kind of see why it's important to have that regional, on-the-ground knowledge and that regional effort carrying that torch. Because without our extra mapping effort, we would have missed a lot of that quality habitat in Chautauqua County. We wouldn't have made it all the way up to Lake Ontario and fleshing out kind of those connections and linkages between it. So that is what our calling is, and you might be wondering, well, what does a wildway look like if you're on the ground? And the main components of a wildway is permanently protected land. This is the floating fen, the newest permanently protected land. Thanks to member and donor help, we were able to protect this property at the end of the year. And what the Wildway is going to be, the heart of the Wildway is permanently protecting land through nature preserves and sanctuaries like Floating Fen, but then also working with private landowners to enact what are called conservation easements on properties, where private landowners will still own the property, but the Land Conservancy will work to put a legal protection that prevents that property from being developed. So it stays in private hands, but the wildlife values are still protected, and that can still serve as a connective landscape for that wildlife to move through. So the combination of permanently protecting land through buying it directly and putting on legal agreements is how we are going to really get the core of the Wildway to happen. And you get the benefit of having cool places to visit, like all the sundews down in Floating Fen that once the trails are made, we're very excited to have everyone come and visit. And then the other part of the Wildway is, well, we have core habitats. We got to figure out how we reconnect them. When we're still in the paws of that black bear, it's not going to be easy to move through from Allegheny State Park today. So, wouldn't it be cool if we had a giant bridge like this over the 90? I mean, just imagine. This is up in Banff National Park where they have a wildlife overpass. So thinking about how are we going to get wildlife from one core habitat to another core habitat, you can send them over on an overpass. You can also send them underneath the road on a culvert. So black bear, they like going under the road more than they like going over the road. So we got to figure out how can we allow that black bear to continue moving. And sometimes the projects can be giant, like that Trans-Canada Highway, but sometimes wildlife connectivity doesn't have to be as intense as that. They can be small. We can retrofit culverts that we already have, put a shelf that will allow that fisher or that bobcat to still be able to get through. Or thinking even smaller, what about our smaller creatures like our turtles, our salamanders? They also are suffering the consequences of a disconnected landscape. Where can we find opportunities to even make small structures that allow those small organisms to also have connectivity? So the two main components of a wildway are that permanently protecting land and then making sure that that land is connected to each other. I will put a shameless plug in if you want to hear the details on reconnecting landscapes and building wildlife crossings. I just recently recorded an episode of a podcast for Bird Note called Bring Birds Back, where I interviewed our partners at the Wildlands Network about their work building wildlife crossings down in the Pigeon Valley Gorge in North Carolina. So learning from the organization that's been at it a little bit longer and figuring out how we can carry the torch up here. So check that out. It just released last week. And then, just showing there is a lot of potential. This is just an example on all of just large culverts. All those red dots are just opportunities for culverts that we already have in the region, and how we can figure out how we can work with our partners at the Department of Transportation to figure out, how can we improve these culverts and allow wildlife crossings, but then also allow for the safety of humans as well, because nobody wants to hit an animal with their car. It is unsafe and costs a lot of dollars. So the DOT has a mission to stop wildlife collisions just from a safety standpoint. So it's one of those of, all right, how can we work together? We have the habitat wildlife connectivity interest. They have keeping humans safe. And the cool thing is there's a lot of momentum right now for wildlife crossings. There are literally millions of dollars available in the federal government through the bipartisan infrastructure law that is specific for wildlife crossings. There is a wildlife crossings pilot program in the federal government right now. This is where they just released funding for recent projects. So our goal is, all right, how can we make sure that we get a dot up in Western New York? How can we get all of the collaborations, all the parties together? We have the plans. How can we figure out, get those priority crossings identified so that we can get some of that millions of dollars of federal funds here in Western New York? Not to mention, there's also great momentum on the land protection side as well. Both the federal government and the state government have enacted legislation to protect 30% of the planet by 2030. So how can we be poised to get at the billions of dollars available at the federal government? How can we harness the New York State Bond Act that recently got passed in New York State and have all of our ducks in a row in Western New York to make sure that we can get at all of this great momentum of funding that is available? Because we have a lot of work to do. This is the current status of our Wildway, well, I should say the current status of protected area in Western New York, where we only have about 6% of Western New York is currently protected. All of these green dots are protected areas of land. You can see that the majority do actually fall within our red outlined Wildway. But even inside the Wildway, we only have about 9% of that Wildway planning area is protected. And the scariest statistic on here is the linkages. So only 1% of our linkages are currently protected, so those areas that are connecting those big core areas to each other. So pretty big calling, it's pretty big daunting. I mean, we have big daunting challenges, so we have, big daunting solution of the Wildway to solve it. And if we look at New York State 30 by 30 and figure out, all right, well, how do we harness this momentum? Right now, about 20% of New York State is protected, and in order to get to 30 by 30, we're going to need about 2 to 3 million more acres to make that. So by our math, the ratios of protected, how much of the protected areas currently fall within the Wildway outside of it versus outside of it, we have calculated that we need to protect almost 1 million acres within the Western New York Wildway to meet 30 by 30 in Western New York. So definitely a lot of acres that need to be protected in 6 years. But the interesting thing is, if you look at where the current protected areas exist right now in New York State, you can see that they are all lumped in the Adirondacks. You got a lot in the Catskills. Look how much potential we have in Western New York. So part of the calling of the Wildway is saying, all right, we did a great job in the Adirondacks, we did a good job in the Catskills, how can we focus this next round of land protection effort in Western New York where we have so much opportunity? And now we have the plan. And then this is just a map show that was released by our partners at the Wildlands Network that they mapped out, where are the most climate resilient lands in Western New York to protect. And they said, hey, New York, as we go forward on our 30 by 30, we should be protecting our most important climate resilient lands and then our most important lands for wildlife connectivity. And they provided this map. And then, wait a minute, you can almost see the Western New York Wildway was justified on that map as well. So we also welcome New York State to follow this plan to protect land because it will be in the Wildway. And then that brings us to, well, what are we up to today? So today we are working on building the Wildway. One of the things that I'm up to is we have a wildlife occupancy study going on right now, trying to figure out, we did a lot of that mapping based on where we think animals are going to be, but it would be great to get direct evidence of getting them on camera moving through the landscape. So we are going this year, we have cameras that we are putting out throughout the Wildway to try and get photos of animals moving through. Half of those are going to be on protected lands, then the other half are going to be at roadway, culverts, and bridges to see, well, are there any animals that are trying to use these culverts already, and then where are some opportunities that we can prioritize for those wildlife crossing projects? So we're working with the DOT to figure that out. So hopefully we'll have some fun wildlife photos at the end of this field season this year. We are protecting land. We have a project right now down in Allegheny County. So we have a $2 million grant to protect land in the Black Creek watershed. So down in this core habitat in Allegheny County, if you or anybody you know has a 50 to 100 or even more acre parcel in this property, please call me because we have the money to protect land. So we are working on protecting land already in the Wildway in our project area. And then we are building that partner network. So the Wildway is such a big, daunting plan. It's something that the Land Conservancy cannot do alone. It's something that is going to be a combination of organizations, agencies, individuals, municipalities, all coming together to build this large, daunting plan. So we are putting together a network of those organizations to bring everyone to the table so that we have those collaborations in place so that we could take advantage of all of that momentum at the state, federal levels, and make sure that we can protect and keep our Western New York as viable as possible. So this is from our ribbon cutting of the Allegheny Wildlands, just kind of showing the power of community. And it's with that I would like to thank you for listening to our spiel. So that is the Western New York Wildway. If you're wondering, well, how can you be a part of the Western New York Wildway? Well, we are a nonprofit organization, so obviously we love to have more members of our organization. And if the Wildway is something that calls you directly, there is actually a way you can donate directly to the Wildway that will allow us to focus on this work and focus on reconnecting Western New York. And then if you, after this talk, if you're like, wow, I really want to go through that map again, I want to pretend that I'm a bear, go to our website, Western New York Land Conservancy, and check out our page for the Western New York Wildway, and you can kind of go through the story map and explore it for yourself. But with that, I would like to thank you all very much, and I would love to answer any questions that you have.
And I want to remind you that if anybody has any questions, we'd like you to use the microphone because we're recording this. Any questions?
Yeah.
Amazing presentation, by the way. This is really awesome, and I love that you've scaled it up to the state it is. My question is there ways to engage volunteers within the Wildway project? Do you have things planned for that? I guess that's my own question.
Yeah. It's a good one, too. Right now, the way that I'm thinking about using volunteers is with that wildlife occupancy study that we have a lot of cameras that are going to be going out. So I'm like, man, if we could figure out how we can marshal some folks to go out and check on those. But that is a great question, and one we're hoping to really figure out as we build our Wildway partner network and really kind of bring everyone together for that implementation. And then from there, once we start figuring out, all right, who has individual projects that might need some help with stewardship and things like that, that we're hoping that might be a good kind of vehicle to really engage that kind of individual volunteerism and contribution. So I would say right now, not yet, but in the near future, I see yes, because we have a lot of cameras to check on, and then even farther future of this is a lot of land to steward, so I'm sure there is going to be the call for more hands to make light work. Good question.
Yeah, just a question. The 3 mammalian species that you used to establish the corridor, were those based on observational data, or were those predicted based on habitat?
Yes, so those were predicted based off primarily of habitat features. We did work with a qualitative ecologist is who ran the circuscape analysis. So I wish she was here to kind of explain the really intricacies of circuscape analysis, but it was looking at the landscape qualities and not necessarily species data. The one unfortunate thing in Western New York is we don't have as much direct species data as, well, we need for the Wildway. So we're hoping that now that the Wildway is established, and we're hoping to bring on our partners in academia, we can get more studies that focus in the Western New York region, but we don't have as many kind of direct observational studies, so we did the landscape analysis.
Marcus, thank you. It was great to hear you give this talk and learn about this more in that way. You shared about mammals.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about some herps. Have you overlaid bird migration data? Right, I'm seeing the missing corridor that we all know and love here, but I am seeing some of those pathways, some of those places where we love to bird. And so can you talk about how you think this could impact birds? How we here, we have our Lights Out initiatives that we're working on here with Birds on the Niagara, ways that we can marshal our birding community to track and study and assess the impact of this, thinking long-term, thinking in that 6 years, thinking in that 10 years, thinking to the 30, what can we as Birds on the Niagara community and our broader birding community do to help out and understand that?
Yeah, and definitely a great question. I know, I won't lie, it did hurt my heart when I saw this map come out and the Niagara River corridor wasn't there. That was one of the first things I said to Marisa and said, how can we get the Niagara River corridor in there? Which I will argue, the Niagara River watershed is well represented, so all of the major headwaters for the Niagara River that we know and love, you need an intact headwaters in order to have that healthy Niagara River. So that would be one thing that I would say is the Wildway is a good way to protect those headwater areas. But it is a good question, and the reason that the Niagara River wasn't included is if you look at the heart of the Wildway is looking at where we have those big core areas of forest, and there is no big core area of forest directly along the river. There is that fragmented. So while it might not seem directly connected, there is that protecting the forested habitat, and then also just thinking about how birds do migrate through, using a lot of our low flyers, a lot of our ground nesting or ground birds will also utilize these connected areas as well. So there is that bird connection, but it doesn't necessarily, touch the Niagara River. And then the next part of your question was.
So we're thinking about how this.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I would say it would be figuring out where are those critical habitats. So I start thinking of where along the Wildway would be important for short-eared owl habitat, or where can we get more data to kind of build the case that we do have important bird areas. There are at least 4 important bird areas within the Wildway of Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge, Letchworth, Keeney Swamp, the Allegheny or the Lake Erie frontage, but I will say that the focus of the Wildway is probably a little bit more that really that land protection side. But anytime that we can get more data that is collected by birders out there, especially things like the Breeding Bird Atlas, that we can get that documented so that we can go and then when we do the analysis because previous analysis so far have been focused on those mesocarnivores. So there is the opportunity as the data is presented. So I would say the fun part about birding is that you get to be out there having fun and then also collecting hard science data that can influence plans and things like that. So that would probably be the best way is figuring out where would be places to prioritize that prioritize action in the Wildway based off of that kind of observational data.
Any other questions? Thank you, Marcus.
Cool, thank you all.